everyone's still coming in. Shall we wait for a while or just we start?
Yeah, uh, maybe we have to inform that to Professor Taylor that Indonesia usually are always late, like 5 or 10 minutes.
Not
Is it
really
No
wait.
okay for
problem.
you to wait?
No problem.
So maybe we should
Yeah.
wait for another 5 minutes, Veronica?
Yeah, sure. That's great. And while we're waiting, can I just check with you both, Partnov Rizal and Masari, just about the flow of the session. So, Ari, I think you told me that the session was 11 until 12:40. What we would usually do in our class is maybe I would talk for 30 minutes, but with some break for questions and discussion. And then we'd have questions and discussion. And we might have a 5-minute break in the middle if people are getting tired. Does that sound okay?
Well, usually we don't have a break for
Okay.
this session, but
Okay.
should you wish for a break for like a 5 minute, that's fine. I
Yeah.
guess that will be great as well for all of us. I think we will adjust to your suggestion.
Okay, no problem. Well, let's see how we go. And how many participants are in this class?
The thing is, the formal registration is about 20 students,
Mhm.
but this course is open to, like I said, this is open to all law student from all over Indonesia. So we might expect more than 20 that will join the session of today.
No problem. And could I also check when people are asking questions, do they usually ask the questions directly or do they also use the chat function?
Yes. Uh, well, my proposal would be both. I guess for those who are not able to give question directly, they can write their question on the chat box.
Yep.
But then they can also ask you directly.
Yep, no
Also,
problem.
a good opportunity for them to to interactive with you as well.
Exactly. And because the topic's a very big topic, I've just taken one slice of the topic, but I imagine that there will be lots of other questions. So I'm going to invite people to ask about anything.
Yes. Okay. That'll be lovely. And Veronica, I will be your assistant in presenting the PowerPoint. So I will be operating the PowerPoint, and you just
Oh,
say,
lovely. Thank you.
"All
So
right."
you'll do the screen share and I will just say next slide.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. We already have 32 students now, so we can start, I think.
Okay. Like, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, adik-adik sekalian, Bapak Ibu dosen yang saya lihat di sini ada beberapa yang ikut serta. Terima kasih banyak sudah mengikuti perkuliahan ini. Saya mohon izin untuk berbicara dalam bahasa Inggris karena tamu kita pada pagi hari ini adalah Profesor Veronica Taylor, profesor dari Australian National University. Very good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for your time for joining our session this morning. This session is part of the course on the regional and comparative law at the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia. And we have the privilege to host a special session that will be delivered by Professor Veronica Taylor. She is a professor of law and regulation from the School of Regulation and Global Governance, Australian National University. We are very glad that Professor Taylor has availed herself the time for the session today, and topic about the federal system under pressure, Australia. So the aim is to understand in the way of a comparative study how is the legal system of Australia. Indeed, Australia is one of the most important system that we need to know, apart from we are the closest neighbor, but also we have a number of relations with Australia, including really close relation in terms of education or higher education. Without further ado, I guess I don't need to explain more about Frederica Taylor. You can Google Frederica Taylor on the website of ANU, and there will be so much information about her on the website. But we are looking forward for her presentation on the Australian legal system. Veronica, time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Selamat siang, everybody. And an especially warm hello to my colleagues at Universitas Indonesia, Pak Ari and Pak Nofrizal. It's really great to be here with you and with your students, and as I understand it, with participants from other universities around Indonesia as well. So welcome, everyone. Pak Ari asked me to talk about the Australian legal system, and that's a big topic. So what I thought I'd do today is look at our legal system from the angle of what has been happening recently. So this past year in Indonesia and in Australia, we've been battling with COVID-19. And one of the things that we've discovered from COVID-19 is that when you are meeting a big challenge like a pandemic, it puts pressure on your legal system and it puts pressure on your political system. And so it's interesting to look at how the legal system performs under that pressure. One of the big differences between Indonesia and Australia is that Australia is a federal system. It's a federal system in the common law tradition. And so I thought that that would be also an interesting thing to look at, because COVID-19 has revealed a lot of aspects of federalism that are inefficient, not very strong under pressure, and that we need to actively rethink. So I hope this is interesting for you. I'm going to invite you to ask questions, and I'll pause about halfway through the presentation so that we can check on any questions. Also, if you have questions about any aspect of the Australian legal system, we can discuss today. So your questions don't need to be limited to what I'm presenting. So if that sounds okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So I said that Australia is a federal system, a federation. So what that means is that we have a national government, which is our federal government. It was formed in 1901 when all of the colonies, what were then English colonies, came together voluntarily to form a federation. So those colonies remain as states and territories within the federation. So we have 6 states and 2 territories. The 2 territories are the Australian Capital Territory, which is where ANU is located. So it's the capital, a little bit like Washington, DC. And the second territory is the Northern Territory, the big northern part of Australia that has a very small population. Our states are different sizes. You can see that Western Australia is enormous, and the island in the south, Tasmania, is very small. So there's a huge difference in size, population, income, and also big differences in the economy of each state. You'll also see that we have 530 local governments, all of which are elected. And you can see in the third map at the bottom of the page that those local governments are where the population is. and much of our population lives on the coast, with a very light population or light distribution of population in the centre of the country. So we have lots of governments. So that's something that is similar to Indonesia, but the constitutional arrangements are different, and we'll look at those in just a moment. Next slide. So how do we arrange the roles and the responsibilities between all of those different governments? The first basis for dividing the roles and responsibilities is the Constitution, and that was created in 1901. So the Constitution divides the roles of the federal government and the state government. The federal government has responsibility for national areas like foreign affairs and trade, and the state governments have responsibility for everything that is not listed as a federal responsibility in the Constitution. Significantly, although the Constitution allows the states to impose taxes, as a practical matter, most of the tax power is with the federal government. So all of the income tax goes to the federal government. So what that means is that regardless of the roles and responsibilities that are listed under the Constitution, because the federal government has the tax power, it has the economic power to drive the direction of law and the direction of policy. Most of the services to citizens are delivered by the states, but the states are delivering those services with money that they receive from the federal government. And when there's a need for a joint policy decision, those joint policy decisions historically have been made by what we call the Council of Australian Governments, COAG. So this is a kind of committee where the federal government and the state governments all come together regularly to discuss how the budget should be divided, but also who should be responsible for what policy. An example of a big policy that COAG has been discussing in recent years is water policy, because rivers cross the borders of many states. Australia is a dry continent, and so managing the water requires a lot of collaboration. It's quite a difficult policy issue. Next slide. So if you look at the Constitution and you look at the powers of Parliament, this is the list of powers that belong to the federal government. So you see trade, taxation, borrowing money, postal services, defence. And one of the powers that belongs to the federal government is quarantine. And quarantine became enormously important this year because of the arrival of COVID-19. So Australia's an island. After the pandemic was declared, we closed the borders of the country, but we had to allow citizens to return. So those returning citizens have all been required to stay at a hotel for 2 weeks as part of quarantine. And the federal government was able to deploy the army to control quarantine in places like Sydney. And it was able to do that under its federal powers under the Constitution. So although we don't use the army very much domestically, it was a legitimate use of the army from a constitutional point of view for quarantine purposes. Okay, next slide, please. So COVID has been a big challenge. And one of the things that the federal government did first was to follow the World Health Organization's advice. But the World Health Organization moved relatively slowly. So our federal government actually declared COVID to be a global pandemic a couple of weeks before the World Health Organization. And Australia became rather unpopular with China because in April, we also called for an international inquiry into how COVID started as a way of learning how to avoid this situation again. Next slide. Something that happened in response to COVID that was quite dramatic was that the federal government, under the Prime Minister, who at the moment is Scott Morrison, formed a national cabinet. So a moment ago, I told you that the way that the federal government and the state governments cooperate is through the Council of Australian Governments, COAG. But in March this year, the government formed a national cabinet. And the national cabinet was a meeting between the Prime Minister and the Premier of each state and territory, all of those government leaders. So it was an intergovernment platform. And in May, the Prime Minister announced that this national cabinet would replace COAG. So in response to COVID-19, we have made a really big change to the shape of our government. This national cabinet doesn't have any status under our Constitution. It's not mentioned in the Constitution. And although it's called a cabinet, it's not actually a cabinet. It's more like a committee from a legal standpoint. And the distinction is important because if you have a cabinet, one of the rules is that the deliberations within the cabinet, the discussions, must be confidential. So cabinet confidentiality is a key rule or convention of common law style parliamentary government. This national cabinet is more like a committee, but the Prime Minister has just created it. However, all of the state governments agreed to this arrangement. And so it's a new organ of government that has been created through consensus. And the reason that the National Cabinet was created was so that we could get faster decision-making by the key political leaders, and so that they could meet frequently. They were meeting every week for most of this year. Next slide. Alongside the National Cabinet, the government also formed the Australia Health Protection Principal Committee. And this was a committee made up of all of the chief health officers from each of the states and territories, as well as the Australian Chief Medical Officer. The Chief Medical Officer is a public service position and is the Chief Medical Advisor to the government. And as part of the work of this committee of medical experts, the government created a budget agreement to distribute special budget amounts to the states to help respond to COVID-19. The federal government and the state governments also made an agreement about who would pay for the healthcare under COVID-19, and also who would pay for the extra health services and protection measures that would be needed during the pandemic. So this is also new, and it has been created in response to this very serious situation that we've had. Next slide. one of the things that has been really striking about the posture of our government during COVID-19 has been that all of the policy decisions at the national level and at the state level have been led by science. So this is a photograph of the national television broadcaster. It's a national program that discusses current affairs and current issues. And the person on the right of the photograph is the Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt. But sitting beside him in the middle of the photograph is the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Brendan Murphy. And every time the Health Minister appeared in public, particularly during the first 6 months of COVID-19, the Health Minister always appeared with the Chief Medical Officer beside him. And the daily briefing on the status of COVID was given by the Chief Medical Officer. So what's been interesting during this period has been the government reliance on research and reliance on those medical experts. New slide, please. Now, something that's also interesting is that Australia's policy on COVID was different from New Zealand's policy. So New Zealand is recognised as a country that was particularly successful in combating COVID-19. But Australia and New Zealand took different approaches. So this was the political part of the decision-making. So Australia's posture was that what we would try to do was minimise the number of people who became infected or sick, and also try to minimise how sick they became and try to minimise the death rate. And by minimising the number of people, we would reduce the demand on health systems. So this is what was popularly called flattening the curve. So instead of the cases going up and up and up, we would flatten the curve so that there would still be some cases, but they would be controlled. And in that way, the hospitals wouldn't be overburdened and the system wouldn't break under pressure. And there was also a lot of emphasis on helping citizens manage their own risk and the risk to their family and community. New Zealand, on the other hand, decided to eliminate COVID. And so the way that they did that, at least during the first part of the pandemic, was to lock down New Zealand, require everyone to stay at home and to really maintain that for at least a month. And New Zealand succeeded in that by getting everyone in the country to stay at home and not move. They managed to almost completely eradicate COVID-19. Of course, the advantage that New Zealand has is that it's a small country and it's a unitary legal system, so it's one single government. Australia is a much bigger country and we're a federal system. So getting agreement from the state leaders was more complicated for us. And so our goal was not to eliminate COVID, but just to control it. And I'll describe problems that we've had with that, but more or less that policy has been successful. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the way that we did this legally was to declare a state of disaster and a state of emergency. But that can only be declared on a state-by-state basis because the states are the ones that have that power under the Constitution. And the state where this was tested most extensively was the state of Victoria. Victoria is in the south of Australia. The capital is Melbourne, and it's the second largest state by economic power after New South Wales. So the biggest city is Sydney, then Melbourne, then Brisbane. Victoria had a particular problem because when people returned home to Victoria from overseas and were put into quarantine in the hotels, Victoria decided not to use the army and not to use the police to guard those hotels. Instead, the Victorian government employed a security company, so like the guards that you see outside big buildings in Jakarta, to guard the hotel. And they didn't do a good job. So the quarantine itself became a location where COVID started to spread. And once COVID got out of those hotels and started to spread through Victoria, it spread very quickly all over Melbourne. And so the Victorian government, in order to stop that, declared a state of disaster and a state of emergency. And the effect of that is to give the state government additional power to control movement of people, and also to use the police to more strongly enforce new administrative rules. So Victoria then rolled out very, very detailed rules about what people were permitted to do. It had a second wave of COVID, and only last week have people in Victoria been permitted to leave their houses. People in Melbourne, in the big city. So Melbourne has been in lockdown for almost 6 months, but the results of that have been very good. So Victoria was able to go from having a lot of COVID cases to really reducing them down to zero. But the mechanism for doing that, the legal mechanism, was to declare a state of emergency and also to roll out very, very, very detailed and quite strict rules that have been very hard for people and very, very hard for businesses and for the economy. So basically, they stopped the economy for a number of months. So the cost of doing this has been very high, but the legal implementation has been very, very effective. Next slide, please. Because the rules are changing all the time, one of the challenges for ordinary citizens is, how do I know what I should be doing? If you keep, as a government, if you keep creating new rules and restrictions, how can I comply? And one of the things that government did very effectively was to create a single website portal that people could check for all of the rules in all of the states and territories. So if you live in New South Wales, you can check the New South Wales rules, and you can also check whether you can travel to Victoria. At the moment, we still can't travel. So if I want to go home to see my family in Victoria, I'm not permitted to travel there. And in order to find out when I can travel, this is the website that I would check. So this is also interesting because one of the requirements of rule of law, as you know, is that the law should be announced and it should be visible to people. You should be able to know what the rules are. So government had to work a bit harder to actually publicise the many new rules that it was making. New slide, please. And the reason for that website becomes very clear when you start to look at the detail in the rules. So the federal government created what it called a 3-step framework for COVID. And although the font, the size of the words on the slide are very small, it actually covers all of the industries in Australia and shows industry sector by industry sector how the rules will change. And if everything's going well, we proceed on to the next stage. But if more COVID cases are discovered, then we go back to the previous stage. So this is like a regulatory roadmap for each industry. Industry by industry, these are the new regulations. They're pretty complicated, and so government has had to work hard to communicate them and communicate them effectively at the federal level and at the state level. New slide, please. One of the things that has been very important has been this public messaging and also the visible public leadership. So this is a photograph of the Victorian political leader, Premier Daniel Andrews. And Daniel Andrews has been Victoria's Premier, and he's been responsible for these very, very strict rules that I just described to you. So he closed his economy and he forced everyone in Victoria to stay at home for nearly 6 months. That has made him rather unpopular, but something that he did very effectively was to model the behaviour that he was asking for from the citizens and to appear on television at the same time every week, giving a report of how Victoria was doing, what progress was, and what the next step would be. And he's been very, very consistent in that. And although people have complained about him and although people have disagreed with his policy position, he has been very effective in making the new regulations seem very legitimate because he's been visible and has been explaining them in a very steady and consistent way. That's also new. We haven't had that before in Australia. Our political leaders have not been on television every week explaining exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, what the scientific basis for the regulations is, and what the roadmap will be to the next stage. So this is a new feature of political life in Australia, but it's also a new feature of our legal system. Next slide, please. What Dan Andrews is using and what other political leaders are using in this approach to COVID-19 is also what we call the regulatory legal pyramid. So this is the idea that you shouldn't command people to change and impose a lot of penalties. What you should do is start at the bottom of the pyramid and assume that everyone is virtuous. Assume that most people will try to do the right thing most of the time. And if you explain what you need them to do and you give a coherent and legitimate reason for that, most people will say, okay, I don't like the rule, I don't want to stay home, but I will do it. And you rely on most people to be virtuous and self-regulate. And if they fail to do that, if they don't follow the rule, you explain again and you give them another chance. This is what we call the restorative justice part of the pyramid. A smaller number of people are what we call rational actors. So when the new regulations are announced, those rational actors will decide whether to follow the rule based on whether they think they will be detected and punished. So, for example, one of the rules that Victoria used was that, first of all, everyone must stay at home, and only one person could leave the house to go and get food. Then at the next stage, everyone must stay home, but you can travel within 5 kilometres of your home, but only to get food or for essential reasons like visiting the doctor. And at that point, once people were allowed out of their homes, of course, some rational actors decided that they would get food, but they would get food from their favourite restaurant or from McDonald's, even if that was 10 kilometres away. And what they discovered was that the police were waiting for them. So with this new rule came some pretty heavy policing to ensure that if you were a rational actor and you decided to break the rule, there would be a high probability of you being caught. Some people during this period held parties at home and invited lots of friends and said, oh, you know, don't worry about Daniel Andrews, we're going to just enjoy ourselves. And the people who did that were reported by their neighbours and they were prosecuted. And the fines that they had to pay were really high. So this next stage of the regulatory pyramid is designed to persuade rational actors that rationally they should follow the rules. If they break them, there will be very strong deterrence. And then the top of the pyramid is really where you have very, very powerful, serious penalties, but those are reserved for people who are genuinely bad actors, people who won't follow the rule, no matter what you say, people who are just determined to be selfish. So the incapacitation, prosecution, jail, or in the case of a company, dissolving the company, the most serious penalties are reserved for people at the top of the pyramid. So the style in which the regulatory systems are designed is this kind of pyramid style, where we start with dialogue and persuasion, and then if you're not persuaded, we show that there's a credible threat of punishment. And then the very serious penalties are just reserved for people at the top of the pyramid. New slide, please. One of the ways that we built out the bottom of the pyramid was to do some new things. So here in my territory, in the Australian Capital Territory, our university developed a new way of doing contact tracing, where we basically trained large groups of university students, mainly medical students, to be the ones who would telephone people, particularly people who had been travelling and who had come back, to check that they were at home and check that they were following the rules and check that they understood what they needed to do and check whether they had any COVID symptoms. You can't do that kind of checking unless you have a lot of people available, and most health systems didn't have big teams to do this. So by using university students, we were able to boost the capacity of the health system, but also to reinforce the bottom of the pyramid. So to remind people in a very personal way that they were responsible for their own health and responsible for everybody else as well. When I flew back to Australia in February, I came back from some work I was doing in Myanmar, and so I had to stay at home for 2 weeks to quarantine. And I got a call from one of these contact tracing team members, someone who was very young but very pleasant, and was just calling to remind me and make sure that I understood what the rules were. So that's a very effective way of getting compliance from the people that you want to target without relying on the police and without relying on lots of complicated legal procedures. Later on, during different periods of lockdown for COVID, governments did use police to actually check that people were at home because, of course, citizens get tired of following the rules, and they, may, if they're rational actors, decide that they'll test the system and test how strong the rules are. And at that point, you need to escalate the deterrence by bringing in someone who's a bit stronger and a bit more intimidating than just a friendly university student who's giving you a phone call. Next slide, please. If you'd like to read more about the pyramid, you can download this free book that my colleagues and I have written about all aspects of regulation. The chapters are really short and they're really, really interesting. New slide, please. Okay, so in the next part of the presentation, I want to talk about how law has been used in Australia when things haven't worked well. But before I go to that second part of the presentation, maybe I could just stop here and we could just check whether there are questions or comments. So maybe,
Yes.
Masari, if you just take the slides down for a minute, we can check with the group.
Yes. I do have a number of questions here, Veronica. But first, I saw Ian Risky wish to ask a question directly to Professor Taylor. Ian Risky, are you there? Okay, maybe she's out now. Okay, maybe I should read the question for you, Professor. The first question is from Putri from Universitas Indonesia. She asked, how is the budgeting system of Australian government in this COVID-19 emergency situation? And whether or not the regulation has provided all of the legal basis for this situation before it happens. I mean, is there any anticipation in terms of regulation? You want to ask ask directly, or I should?
Yes, sure. That's a great question. No, we didn't anticipate COVID-19. So no, there was no budget preparation or provision for this kind of problem. The government formed a committee of business people to advise on how to get business started again after COVID-19. And one of the recommendations that is now being implemented is that we will focus a lot on deregulation. So what COVID-19 has revealed is that if you want the economy to move quickly, you need to reduce some of the regulation. So there's now a new task force on deregulation. So we can anticipate that that will speed up over the coming months. Australia is lucky. We had, until COVID-19, nearly 25 years of budget surpluses or 25 years of economic growth. So we're a relatively wealthy country, and therefore we can afford to pay for a lot of the adjustment that was required under COVID, but we also borrowed a lot of money. So we now have a lot of national debt that we didn't have before, and it will take decades to pay off those debts. But we were able to borrow money easily because of the strength of our economy. But the economic cost of COVID has been very high.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Another question from Aura from Universitas Hasanuddin in Makassar. How well or what is the success rate of the public health agenda that has been designed by the Australian government, and whether or not the Australian society completely compliance the rules from the government?
It's a great question. Thank you for that one. I will show you the numbers in the second part of the presentation. The policy has been, from a public health standpoint, very, very, very successful. But the economic cost of that success is very high.
Okay. I saw Abdurrahman raise his hand.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, please, Abdurrahman.
Okay, thank you, sir. My name is Abdur. Thank you so much, Ms. Veronica, for bringing us the presentation about how Australia responds to COVID-19, especially during this pandemic. My question is actually quite simple. How do you see in the future, after COVID-19 is no longer existing, hopefully, how do you see that cooperation among countries, especially from the perspective of the Australian government, in terms of mitigating any kind of new pandemic in the future, knowing that all countries are now, I see, all prepped up in regards to mitigating any kind of widespread virus like this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. COVID-19 has demonstrated a couple of things. Domestically for Australia, it has demonstrated that a federal system is very inefficient. And if we look at the United States, we can see that multiplied many, many times. So what's likely to happen domestically is that Australia is likely to become a more centralised legal and political system. For Australia's cooperation with other countries, absolutely, COVID has shown that we have to cooperate, and we probably need to invest more in development assistance for our neighbours in Asia and the Pacific. We also probably need to lobby more for the relaxation of intellectual property rights to allow things like the equitable distribution of vaccines. And Bill Gates has been speaking very strongly about this recently, because whilst it's great that the big pharma company Pfizer has announced that it has created an effective vaccine, we don't want the result of COVID to be that we pay Pfizer an enormous amount of money for that vaccine. Those vaccines have to be available on terms that are fair, particularly for developing and middle income economies. And I think you can imagine that Australia will argue very strongly for that, because we have to open our borders for trade and investment. We're an island that depends on trade. And if our neighbours are not doing well, if our neighbours still have problems with COVID-19, that's absolutely a problem for them, but it's also a really big problem for us. So we have to help people solve this problem, particularly in this immediate region.
Thank you, Professor Taylor. There's a question from Mr. Aji from Universitas 11 Maret from Solo. How is the coordination between the states and the territories in responding to COVID-19, whether or not it has like an umbrella regulation or policy from the federal government, or is it decentralized into the states and territory?
Great question. Thank you. The answer is that it is decentralized. So the reason that the government, the federal government, has created this national cabinet is to try to persuade the states to cooperate. because the states have their own independent power under the Constitution. And one big power that they have is that they control the borders between the states. So at the moment, I'm in Canberra, in the capital, but I can't travel to Melbourne in Victoria. I can't travel for business and I can't travel to see my family because the Victorian government has closed the border. And we had a High Court case, a Supreme Court case a couple of weeks ago, which challenged the constitutional right of the states to control the borders. But the courts said controlling the border is reasonable because of the circumstances of a pandemic. So the answer to your question is that the federal government doesn't have an umbrella power to simply command the states to follow the federal direction. It is a matter of negotiation. And that's what makes federalism complicated and a little bit inefficient. And I think there are some parallels between this situation in Australia and the decentralisation situation in Indonesia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor Sarah. I just want to follow up your statement there. Do you think that's a disadvantage to have this kind of arrangement? Because in terms of containing the spread of the virus, I think the strict what do you call it restriction from state to states, I think it contributes to how the spread itself, rather than like Indonesia. We can't say that from one area that considered as a red zone that should not be restricted, that someone can go to travel and so on. But I guess despite that, we do have a decentralization. I think the central government powers is still more than the power. Correct me if I'm wrong, Pak Nofrizal. Please, Professor.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right about that. There are some advantages for federalism. The big advantage is that in a federal system, you are delivering services and also responding to problems in a way that's much closer to those communities than the federal government is. And so the arguments from the states in Australia are, leave it to us because we know our communities, we know our geography, we know our economic condition, and we are the ones who are best positioned to make a kind of customised response. So let's not make a kind of generic or general response nationally because it's a big country and the responses need to be customised. So that's a positive. And the other positive is that the states have declared hot zones or red zones, and they have also had the power to stop people from moving from those hot zones. So as you'll see when I show you the numbers in a moment, the results of that have been really good because no one's allowed to move, and so the virus is not moving either. So that's been very effective. But trying to get consistency across the country is difficult. So if you're concerned about everyone having the same legal rights and experiencing law and regulation in the same way, it's difficult to get that exact consistency in a federal system, and that requires constant negotiation. And in the past, the big tool for negotiation has been budget. But if you don't have a big budget, you don't have a lot of influence over the states. So there are pluses and there are minuses.
Thank you very much, Professor Taylor. I guess from the chat box, that's all the question. And do you want to have a break for a while, Professor?
I think actually we're okay. Why don't we go back to the next part of the presentation, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A, and we'll see how we go. We can always finish early if we need to. Okay, so far I've described things going quite well. But in fact, we also have had to overcome some big legal and social problems this year. And some of them have been very serious indeed. But I wanted to explain the way in which a common law system in the English tradition goes about fixing problems in its own legal system. So we have built in some mechanisms for actually diagnosing our own problems and fixing them as we go. And I wanted to explain those because these are a little bit different to the mechanisms that you would use in Indonesia. Let's go to the next slide. So the first big problem happened early during COVID. The photograph on the bottom of this slide is a photograph of a big cruise ship called the Ruby Princess. And the Ruby Princess set off from Sydney back in February, March, just as the first information about COVID-19 was coming through. So at this point, citizens and governments knew that there was a problem and that this seemed like a kind of flu that seemed very serious, but we weren't quite sure about how serious it would be. So thousands of people, most of them retired people, got on board this cruise ship and they went off on a short cruise. When they came back to Sydney, there were people on the ship who were sick. And the ship's doctor checked them and made a report and said, you know, these people have symptoms that suggest that they have symptoms that are like flu. But the state government health officers allowed the ship to come to Sydney, and they allowed everyone to leave the ship. And that led to the first outbreak of COVID-19 in New South Wales, because a number of people on the ship had contracted COVID, and of course it had spread on the ship. The ship is a confined environment, so it's the perfect environment to generate lots and lots of COVID cases. So the health system was then confronted with hundreds and hundreds of people with COVID. The response to that was very angry, and there was a lot of debate about who was responsible. Was this the federal government? Was it the state government? Was it the health department? Was it the police? Was it the immigration office? Who should be responsible for checking whether the passengers on the ship were healthy enough to return to Sydney? What the New South Wales government did in response to that was create a special commission of inquiry. And a special commission of inquiry, sometimes called a royal commission, is a kind of special investigation that has all of the powers of a court. And the person who was appointed was a very distinguished lawyer, and he had the power to call witnesses, to require people to give evidence, and then he makes findings. The findings themselves don't have the effect of a legal judgment, but the general pattern is that when the finding is negative, that then is taken directly to court, and criminal proceedings or administrative fines follow from that. And his report was very, very critical of the government. But what's interesting about this was that it happened almost immediately after the event. So you had the catastrophic event, and then you had the Special Commission of Inquiry, you get the results, and then those are implemented almost immediately. Next slide, please. So the Special Commission of Inquiry is independent of government. But at the same time, government also has the power to examine itself. And this has happened at the federal level and also at the state level. So at the federal level, our parliament has two houses. The upper house is the Senate and the lower house is the House of Representatives. The colour for the Senate is red. So you can see in the picture that the desk has red covers to mark the different seats. So we know that this is a Senate meeting room because the colour is red. The colour for the House of Representatives is green. This is just historical. It's an old custom from England. So the upper house, the Senate, formed what's called a select committee. And this select committee on COVID-19 inquired into the Australian government's response to the pandemic. And a select committee has the power to call witnesses and to demand information from government. And it does that on behalf of the citizens. So this is Parliament examining itself. And the reason that the Senate is doing this is that the lower house, the House of Representatives, is of course where the government sits. So the Prime Minister and his cabinet, most of his cabinet, come from the lower house. But the role of the upper house, the Senate, is to review the lower house. And so forming a select committee is one way of reviewing. By reviewing, we mean put pressure on the government. The same mechanism has been used at the state level as well. So in the largest state, New South Wales, the Legislative Council, which is the upper house of that state parliament, established a Public Accountability Committee back in 2018. So that committee has been used this year to conduct an inquiry into the New South Wales government's management of COVID-19. The proceedings from each of those committees are broadcast on national radio every day. So if you want to find out whether the government has been doing a good job in relation to COVID-19, you can just turn on the radio and hear the government ministers and also the public officials being interviewed and examined by these committees. So it's a very public process. And the idea is to have some transparency about whether the policy has been effective and also whether there have been any unanticipated consequences or problems that have arisen. And of course, both committees have discovered plenty of problems. So let's look at the next slide. The other way of checking on government is through the National Audit Office. The National Audit Office looks at the way that the budget has been spent and looks at whether that has been effective or not. And it also looks at the economic response, the economic policy response to COVID. So at the moment, the Audit Office is also checking on the economic policy in relation to COVID and checking on the budget decisions. And we will have a report from the National Audit Office fairly soon. The Audit Office is independent and it sets its own agenda and creates its own inquiries. It reports to the Parliament, but it's not controlled by the Parliament. New slide, please. Now, why were there public inquiries? One of the catalysts or the impulses for the public inquiries was that the regulations that were created had lots of unintended consequences. One consequence was that when the state governments decided to close the borders, it meant that no one could travel across the border, including people who ordinarily would go across the border to get medical care. So in one case that was widely reported, a new baby was born, and the baby was born in New South Wales, but the closest big hospital was in Queensland. And the Queensland government had closed the border. And so the Queensland government said, yes, the baby can come to Queensland, but the mother can't. So the baby was transported to Queensland, the baby was treated in Queensland, but the baby died. And the mother was not permitted to travel with the baby. So she was in that very difficult situation of having a very sick new baby and saying goodbye to the baby, sending the baby off to Queensland and then not seeing it again. Really tragic story. So there was a lot of public outcry, a lot of criticism of the Queensland government, and a lot of people saying to the federal government, wait a minute. We understand the need for strict rules in order to limit the movement of COVID-19, but this situation surely is different. You need to be able to respond more flexibly to these kinds of cases. This was not the only case of its kind. New slide. The second big scandal of the current legal and regulatory response to COVID has been nursing homes. So in Australia, it's not uncommon for elderly people to live in a nursing home, particularly if they need lots of medical care. So most people want to care for their parents at home, but if parents become very sick or if they start to suffer from conditions like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, or if they have very serious medical conditions, quite often they're moved out of home and they are moved to a nursing home which has a higher level of medical care. But what has happened during COVID-19 is that the nursing homes have become a place where COVID really took a very strong grip. And hundreds of old people have caught COVID in nursing homes and have died. A lot of the staff in nursing homes also caught COVID-19. The reason that this was complicated is that the regulation of nursing homes is a federal responsibility, but the nursing homes are located in the states. And so the states have some responsibility because the states have power over things like the employment conditions of the staff, but the states are not ultimately responsible for the regulation of nursing homes themselves. And what you see in this bar chart here is that there were some problems in New South Wales, but most of the nursing home deaths have occurred in Victoria. So when that second wave of COVID occurred in Victoria, it came out of the hotel quarantine problem. It went into the homes of staff at the hotel, and from there it jumped to the nursing homes. And then what we see is, as a result, at least to date, 655 people have died in Victoria in nursing homes as a result of that second wave. So because we had this uncontrolled spread of COVID through nursing homes, this was one of the reasons that the Victorian government shut everything down and locked down the state for another 3 months in order to try to control this spread. New slide, please. So if we look at the numbers in total, someone asked earlier, you know, has this policy been successful? The total number of cases in Australia is currently at about 27,500. The total number of deaths has been quite small, so 907. But of that 907, 685 were in nursing homes. So if we hadn't had the nursing home problem, the actual number of deaths would have been just 200, which, if you think about it, is a tiny, tiny number. But we lost control of the virus in Victoria, and as a result of that, it spread through nursing homes, and the death rate shot up as a result of nursing homes. So all in all, the legal response to COVID has been relatively successful, but we suffered a big setback halfway through, and that setback was in Victoria. And one reason for the setback was the fact that the regulations at the state level are different from state to state. New South Wales used a different way of managing quarantine, and it didn't have a problem, although I showed you New South Wales had the problem with the cruise ship. But Victoria decided not to use the police and not to use the army, and as a consequence, the number of cases in Victoria exploded into a second wave. We have now got control of this, and today I'm really happy to say that we've had nearly a week of 0 cases in Victoria, 0 cases in New South Wales, and in my state, ACT, we've had 0 cases for about the last 5 months. So the results have been good. New slide, please. So I wanted to also say thank you for the opportunity to chat with you about this today. For those of you who don't know Australian National University, I want to invite you to have a look at our website. We're very proud that last week the Times Higher Education rankings for 2021 came out, and ANU remains in the top 100. It's just outside the top 50. But the competition for that top 50 is very, very intense. 59 is a very, very good number. New slide. But more important than that, ANU has ducks. So when you come and visit, you can meet the ducks. The ducks have just hatched because it's spring. So this is what we're seeing on campus at the moment because our campus is beside the lake. So please have a look at our website, and when COVID is over and when we've all been vaccinated, really, really looking forward to you coming to visit in person. So let's thank you very much, Pa'adi, for managing the slides. Let's take the slides down and take some more questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much for the picture of the ducks. It's so adorable. I just wish to to clarify, Professor Taylor, about the budgeting across the states. We know that, especially like in Indonesia, some of the local governments have their own limitation in terms of budget in combating the COVID-19. In terms of Australia, is there any, let's say, discrepancies or differences of capacity in budget allocation from state to states? If there is, how can the federal government overcome this problem?
Thanks, it's a great question. The states are really different from each other. The size, the population, and the economy is really different. So if we go to a state like Western Australia, it's a big state with a relatively small population, and its local economy is based on mining and tourism. So when we think about Western Australia, it's a little bit like Sumatra, and it's a wealthy state. It generates a lot of export income for Australia. So you have a state with small population and big money, and then you have a state like Tasmania that has a small population and no money at all. Tasmania's main industry is tourism, and it produces some really great food, actually. Tasmania produces wonderful food, but it doesn't have a big service economy. So what happens in the national budget discussions is that the states that are generating a lot of tax revenue have to give that all back to the federal government, and then the federal government redistributes. So it takes the money from Western Australia and it gives that money to Tasmania. So Tasmania's happy, but Western Australia is furious, really angry. And Western Australia, at least every couple of years, threatens to leave Australia. They want to become their own country because, after all, you know, they have a strong economy, they're beautiful, they're far away from the rest of Australia. Perth is closer to Singapore than it is to Sydney. So Western Australia feels closer to Indonesia, closer to Singapore than it does to Melbourne and Sydney. So periodically they say, you know, this federation, it's completely unfair. We're out of here. But as a legal matter, they can't leave. So the federal government is responsible for collecting and redistributing all of the tax income, which means individual income tax, but also corporate income tax. And it's controversial.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor. And I have two questions from the students. First, from Jonathan from UI. He asks, aside from the pandemic situation suffered by many countries, including Australia, is there any opportunity during this situation to seek improvement in terms of Australia's legal system?
That's a great question. One big improvement has come in the court system. So up until this year, most of the courts, so we have courts at the federal level, federal court, which also includes a family law court, and then we have courts at the state level. And up until now, most of the courts have said, if you want to come to court, you must come in person. We won't conduct hearings via video conference. The only court that really used video conference hearings was the High Court, our Supreme Court, because it's in Canberra and quite often the witnesses are in other parts of Australia. But what has really changed this year is that courts have been forced to use video conferencing. So this is a big improvement for ordinary citizens because you can now get access to the court via a video proceeding. However, the negative aspect is that the courts have been operating very slowly. And we now have, like Indonesia, a big backlog of cases that are waiting to be heard. And I think yesterday it was reported that most of the judges in the family court are currently handling 900 cases each. And of course, it's humanly impossible to handle 900 cases. And the reason that the family court is getting so many cases is because after everyone has been living in lockdown for nearly a year, family tension, domestic violence, divorce problems have really increased. And in Australia, one of the drivers for that is also consumption of alcohol. So when you get a combination of unemployment, alcohol, and everybody forced to live at home together 24 hours a day, it's a very toxic situation, and that leads to family breakdown, and that then creates a kind of wave of family law cases, which the family court is not really ready for. So a big challenge at the moment is, okay, how are we going to quickly respond to those justice needs without breaking the budget of the courts? Video conference hearings are one response, but we need to find a way to get a lot faster to deliver basic legal services.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Last question coming from Ayu from UI. How is the Australian government, whether federal or state government, to the Indigenous Australians in regards with the COVID-19 treatment?
Thanks very much. That's a great question. The first thing to note is that the Australian government and Australian people's treatment of Indigenous Australians has been very bad historically. And one of the ways that we're trying to repair that damage has been through a very serious debate about whether to change our constitution. And part of the debate is about whether, because Indigenous people are referred to in our constitution as a separate class of people. And Indigenous leaders in Australia would like that part of the constitution changed so that Indigenous people can be recognised as citizens of Australia, but also as First Peoples. And so the request is that we rewrite our constitution, particularly the preamble or the introduction to the constitution, to recognise the special status of Indigenous people as First Peoples. So that has been a very serious debate that has been going on in recent years. And at the moment, it's paused because of COVID. But I am reasonably optimistic that we will get a change to our constitution sometime fairly soon, certainly during my lifetime. The other proposal is to create an advisory body for Parliament, an advisory body that's made up of Indigenous Australians, so that when Parliament is creating law, it creates law through its elected representatives, but it creates law in consultation with our Indigenous Australians. And that proposal is also likely to be successful eventually. During COVID, Indigenous Australians who live in remote parts of Australia were actually lucky because they're protected from COVID by distance. So the infection rates amongst Indigenous communities so far has been very low. Indigenous Australians who live in the cities have, however, a higher risk of getting COVID because COVID is more serious for people who are older or people who have health conditions that are not strong. So if you have some kind of underlying health condition, COVID will make it much worse. But the rates of COVID infection amongst Indigenous Australians at the moment are really, really low. So that's something that we're very grateful for.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Veronica Taylor, for the presentation and the explanation. I don't have more question from the chat box. Is there any question from the floor? Pak Nofrizal, maybe you want to ask something?
No, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, I think we have all of the question, and maybe Professor Veronica, do you have your last remark?
So my last remark is simply to say thank you very much for joining in, and thank you for really, really smart questions. You asked exactly the right questions. And I apologise that I don't have all of the answers. What I wanted to show you today was that Australia is also struggling. You know, COVID has presented big challenges and it has really confronted us with a new reality that we have to take very seriously. We think of ourselves as a fairly advanced legal system and a prosperous country, but COVID has revealed that we need to work a lot harder to make sure that law protects individual citizens. So it's been a good lesson for us, and I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to share some of that with you today. So thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Sorry,
one
Professor
question though.
Taylor. Actually, do you still have time?
Yes.
Yeah, it came out in my mind about the constitutional system. Who proposed the candidate of the Governor General, and how do you elect him or her?
Oh, thank you very much, Pat. That's a great question. So this is a quiz question for the students. Who is the head of state in Australia? We've talked about the Prime Minister, and we've talked about the premiers who lead each of the states, but who is actually our head of state?
Yeah.
So when your president is inaugurated, who should be invited from Australia to represent Australia? And the answer under our constitution is that the head of state is our Governor General, but the Governor General is a representative of the Queen. So Australia still belongs to the Commonwealth, and our symbolic head of state is Queen Elizabeth in England. And the Queen Elizabeth is incredibly popular. We have tried to vote to become a republic a couple of times, and overwhelmingly people voted to stay with the Commonwealth and keep Queen Elizabeth as the Queen. I think that will change when she dies. Prince Charles is not popular, and so after the Queen dies, if we have another vote, we might become a republic. But at the moment, the head of state is the Queen's representative, and the Queen's representative is not elected. He or she is selected by the Australian government and proposed to the Queen, and the Queen then accepts. So at the moment, our Governor General is a man called Peter Cosgrove, and he's a former Army general. But he is very, very, very popular because most of his service in the Army has been doing humanitarian work. And he's regarded as a very moral and very kind and thoughtful person. So we have had a couple of Governor Generals who are, couple of Governor Generals who are ex-Army generals, but we have also had ex-judges and ex-politicians. And the Governor General changes quite frequently. So that's our constitutional arrangement. It's very old-fashioned. It sounds rather strange for a modern country, but we are rather fond of this arrangement. And I think we're fond of it because it's not a presidential system. We are a little bit suspicious of a popularly elected president. And looking at the United States last week, you can understand why.
Mm.
Yeah. So he is or she is proposed by the Prime Minister.
Yes, so not selected by the Queen, but really selected by the Prime Minister. And the constitutional role of the Governor General is to sign all the legislation. So once legislation passes Parliament, it goes to the Governor General for approval. But this is largely symbolic. The Governor General very seldom would refuse to sign something proposed by the government.
Yeah.
So is there any possibility provided by the Constitution to refuse to sign?
Yes. And the big example of that happened in 1975. The government at that time was in a situation where it was quite weak, and there had been lots of scandals, and the opposition had controlled the parliament, and the opposition was refusing to approve the budget. And if the budget is not approved, the country can't run. So the leader of the opposition went to the Governor-General and said, the government has, the Parliament has lost confidence in the government, you must remove the government. And the Governor-General was really reluctant to do that, because interfering in Parliament is a very serious thing. But because the budget could not be passed, at that time the Governor-General agreed to remove the Prime Minister. And he called the Prime Minister in and said, you must resign, I'm going to dissolve Parliament. And it was very shocking, very shocking. It happened in 1975, but we are still talking about this event. And it's still actively debated about whether it was legal or proper for the Governor-General to do this, and also whether the Queen knew what the Governor-General was doing and what the Queen's role was. And the letters between the Governor-General and the Queen at that time have just been made public, just last month. They were protected, and they were in the archives, but no one was permitted to see them. And an academic successfully petitioned the High Court to release the letters. And so now the letters are public, and we can see exactly what the Governor-General and the Queen were discussing. But what it also made clear was that the Queen and the Governor-General were very upset and very cautious about this. It was not an action that they really wanted to take.
Okay, thank you very much for your explanation.
Thank you very much, Pak Rizal. Thank you very much, Professor Taylor. And I have a request. Is it okay to share the slides with the students, Professor?
Oh, yes, please. That's, yeah, I prepared them for you. So please share them and use them. And if you have questions afterwards, by all means, please, through Pak Adi or to me directly, anytime, please just ask. That's very kind of you, Professor Taylor. And again, thank you so much on behalf of the Faculty of Law Universitas Indonesia for your generous lecture this morning. And I hope we can have another session with you with another topics. And before we wrap up this session, I wish to give the announcement for next week webinar of this session, that we're going to talk about the regional law in ASEAN, that we have 3 speakers. First is the head of legal services agreement from ASEAN Secretariat, and the name is Unsufan Nasam, and the second speaker is Professor Tran Viet Dung from Ho Chi Minh City University of Law, Vietnam, and the last speaker is the ambassador for ASEAN, Indonesian Republic of Indonesia, Ambassador Ade. And please register yourself on the link that we will distribute a bit later on. Again, on behalf of the Faculty of Law Universitas Indonesia, thank you so much to all of you that coming from all over Indonesia to join this session. And again, thank you so much. But before we leave, I would like to take a picture, all of us. So if possible, you can turn on the video for a couple of seconds. I will count the picture. Okay. We have 2 screens here. The first screen is 1, 2, 3, cheese. Okay, and the second screen, 1, 2, 3, cheese. All right. Thank you so much again, and please stay healthy to everyone. Professor Taylor, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone.
Everyone in Australia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Taylor.